G'day, my name's Nurchin, and today we're talking about everyone's favourite big hairy hominid, but he's homegrown and true blue. It's the Yowie. Oh, it's been a while. Now, I've always been reluctant to make a video on the cryptid hominids. For some reason they bring out the absolute worst in cryptozoology. I mean, the Yowie is a large, hairy hominid that is hidden off in the wilderness that may make you think of Bigfoot, Yeti, Almas, skunk ape, Yeren, just depends on where you are in the world. And you can't be blamed for making that comparison. All of these creatures often get mixed up or at the very least cross-contaminated. And we already know so little about them. Just the fact they're a hominid is still just assumed. I mean, they're probably a hominid, but still, that's a pretty broad term. So for this video, I'm going to keep it specific and just talk about our guy, the Yowie. There's just going to be a lot of international references in there. Speaking of which, if you are from Australia or you're just a weeb, then the term Yowie may remind you of something else. And yes, that is real, and no, you've probably clicked on the wrong video. But if you are Australian, then the term Yowie may make you think of a chocolate brand of the same name that uses a cartoonish version of the creature as their mascot. Fun fact, these things are actually banned in America due to laws about encasing toys in food. But you can still buy assault rifles in Walmart. Which is just silly, because these things are hardly choking hazards.
Fantastic!
Okay, there's a lot of elements to this creature, so we're going to go all the way back to a time before man that the Indigenous Australians called the Dreamtime or the Dreaming. This was where the features of the world were formed and heroes and spirits walked the land. Now, one of these spirits was the Yowie. He was either a sort of boogeyman that would attack bad people or those who strayed too far from camp, or more like a benevolent spirit often with ties to water or the weather. The different characteristics or his ties to the dreaming would change depending on the different tribes, but what we know of the Yowie today is kind of a culmination of all these different variations. Just like the Bunyip, when the settlers arrived, they heard all these different stories, and a few names in particular stuck out, specifically Yowie, Yahoo, or variations of the hairy man, and they were later used as kind of blanket terms for these creatures. On a side note, there's another creature called a Junjidi, kind of like a Yowie but smaller and more goblin-like. All they do is make a messy situation worse, and their sneaky antics kind of make them seem more like folklore than cryptozoology, so I'm just gonna leave that for now. So, the stage is set, and it's time to start talking about the bare bones of what this creature looks like. Well, not really, because it isn't that simple, and nothing in life is apparently easy. See, usually when I research these creatures, I take the couple of sightings and I pull the information from there. In this case, I wish people would stop seeing this creature. Literally, thousands of reports, and boy, howdy do they fluctuate. So we're gonna compile all that information and we can see what we can pull from there. Starting with just like a simple, not a bit bigger than that, but you know. Starting simple. Let's go. First, height. Pretty consistently taller than your average man, maybe 6 to 7 foot, sometimes as much as 12 feet and sometimes only a few feet high. Color. Probably black or brown, but even the black reports often include a kind of reddish tint. Some people insist it has a white coat or maybe a seasonally changing coat, but if it's a large Australian creature, then its palette's kind of set. Eyes. Probably yellow or red, or both, or just red at night time. I've found that typically the color red is only really used for cryptids that are supposed to be scary, so let's just say yellow and chalk the rest up to Tapetum lucidum. The head. It's well noted as having quite a stocky head and appears to not have a neck. It's got deep set eyes, a protruding brow that often recedes back with the head. It's often said to have a overbite and less hair on its face than the rest of its body. You know, a real looker. The body. This dude has never heard of leg day. Long, thick arms that reach well below the waist, and short and sometimes scrawny legs that give it a sort of waddle as it moves. Some say that it relies on its longer arms for a faster quadrupedal movement. And its feet. Ah yes, its feet. Of course any cousin of Bigfoot is going to attract a lot of attention here. But the information here is so bad, it's almost a complete write-off. 3 toes, 4, 5, 6, big, small. There's a ton of casts of this thing's footprints, but none of them match up or look real. And it's strange. Why are there so many casts of this thing's footprints but never anything else? And if it's heavy enough to leave them, surely there should be far more. Plus, this thing was given the backwards facing foot thing, but yet again, that's just seems to be folklore that always seems to make its way into cryptozoology. And finally, you know what they say about big feet? Comically large. Okay, he's my precious son and I love him, but what does he do? Smell really, really bad. Yep, most eyewitness accounts claim that it smelt awful, somewhere between wet dog all the way to burning mattress. Some eyewitness accounts said they had to break eye contact to throw up on the ground. Now, if that's the reception I got, I don't think I'd want to be found either. This is closely tied with another one of its party tricks. A lot of witness reports, or even reports from people that didn't say they saw it, report this kind of full body terror, like this sheer panic that's often picked up by animals first. Now, this smell or this feeling of panic is said to cause nausea, hallucinations, and effectively madness. Now, it might be easy to compare this to the Flatwoods Monster, but keep in mind, if you run across a giant ape out in the wilderness, then panic seems like more of a logical conclusion than a character trait. Also, it's mostly active at night. A lot of these reports just involve them thumping around the darkness, bumping into buildings and cars. There's one theory that they're trying to torment the things that are encroaching in on their environment, kind of like very ineffective environmentalists. They've also been known to ransack food, from bananas to peanut butter sandwiches. And honestly, these parts of the reports always crack me up. These Yowie hunters leave out fruit and snacks, and they're shocked when they're eaten in the morning. They'll say things like, "Oh, we hung it up really high in a tree from a rope." It's like, yeah man, welcome to Australia. And that brings me to another painful part of Yowie evidence. Yowie bites. Oh wow, did a Yowie attack and bite someone? No, unfortunately not. That'd be pretty sick though. This here is a picture of a Yowie bite. They'll bite into the tree to get to the tasty grubs inside. Delicious. Anyway, this one's easily explained by black cockatoos. They'll latch onto the tree and use their sharp beaks to pry at the bark. Cockatoos. The preferred method of disposing with the evidence, Neil resignedly observes, is to make it fit into the appropriate paradigm no matter how badly. This is an unironic quote from Neil Frost from the book The Yowie in Search of Australia's Bigfoot. Ah yes, the Yowie hunters. Typically with these videos I come across my favourite cryptozoologists all the time, like Ivan T. Sanderson or Carl Schuker, or cryptozoologists that really deep dive on a single cryptid, like Ben Radford with the Chupacabra. Well, with the Yowie, and in the case of most cryptid hominids, you've got so many researchers all piling in on top of each other, either comparing notes and high-fiving, or squabbling and causing drama. There's parts of my research where I found myself literally just reading gossip. But a lot of the information presented today wouldn't be available without them, so I've got to give a quick shout out to Rex Gilroy, Dean Harris, Tim the Yowie Man, Paul Croper, and Tony Healy. The last two were the authors of The Yowie in Search of Australia's Bigfoot, and it was publishings like this that really helped me get an idea of the mindset around researching these kind of cryptids, this kind of anti-establishment approach to research. Now, I'm not going to rant because that would take a video all unto itself, but if you think I'm being too harsh, I'll add a quick little explanation so, editing Nurchin can figure that out later. So we have 1,000 researchers all competing, so we've got 1,001 theories about the existence of the Yowie. But this is always my favourite part of the research, and unlike a lot of the other hominid cryptids, Australia doesn't have any large apes or bears, which are two pretty common explanations for creatures like this. So let's start wrapping all this information together and see what shapes we can make. When the settlers first arrived in Australia, they brought with them the culture and the folklore of their homeland, as well as a lot of other really bad things. And when they first heard from the native people about these hairy creatures living out in the bush, they applied it to their own knowledge of, myth and folklore. Woodwoes and hairy men have been a part of folklore from all around the world, so some comparisons understandably started to happen. Despite the Yowie having nothing to do with this other folklore, it's an easy way to understand things is to compare it to something you already know. And of course, we still see that today. So the indigenous people may have been trying to explain this purely spiritual creature, something not meant to be taken so literally. And the settlers were like, no, I think I know better, and created this larger-than-life Yowie idea that we know today. But fear not, hundreds of years later, the researchers got the message. Ah, spiritual, huh? It's a ghost. Or it's an alien. Or an interdimensional being. Or just a psychic phenomena. All of these theories have tiny bits of evidence each. They think it might be an alien because it was seen near UFO sightings, or it might be a paranormal entity because of its association with thunderstorms. You know, the paranormal and electricity often skipping hand in hand. But every theory of it being an alien or a ghost cause way more problems than they ever answer. So I'm just gonna leave it. It's just nothing. It's never anything. Yes, while doing my research, I came across many interesting theories. Usually the best theories were the ones that the Yowie hunters were quickest to condemn. For example, there was this one theory that was deemed ludicrous, that some frightened witnesses had just been scared by an emu. It makes sense in a lot of these cases. You've got this big shaggy creature with yellowish brown eyes. Now, if you came across that at night, and considering the cultural knowledge of the Yowie, it would definitely explain some of the sightings. Depending on the angle which you saw it, it may just look like it has a hunched back. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not a satisfying answer at all, and it would maybe only explain a couple of these sightings. But I just had to point it out because it got laughed off the stage only a few pages after the chapter about aliens and ghosts. Okay, that's it. No more ragging on the publishings, you get the point. Now with that out of the way, we can get to my favorite theories. The Yowie is just a big, hairy man. Yeah, that's a wrap. That's a wrap. There are two interesting variations on this story. The first being, when the settlers first arrived, they and the indigenous people were aware of each other, but maybe not so much the more unkempt versions. So there are even stories where convicts would escape, and when the indigenous people came across them, they were looking so ragged and unkempt they had no clue what they even were. So stories of the Yowie are being spread around, while there are actual wild men living out in the bush. When people came across them, A, they're probably smelling really bad, and B, they were probably wanted men, so they would escape back into the bushes, kind of perpetuating the myth. There was a great witness report I found where the Yowie hunters were pulling it to pieces trying to make it fit their theories, but the witness insisted that it had been a human. Now, I think that's interesting. He comes across this large hairy creature that disappears back into the bush. He's told by people that that was probably a Yowie, but he insisted there was something innately human about it. That would kind of drag the Yowie more in line with the Wendigo, almost as if wild men are created, not born. And finally, it comes full circle. The Indigenous Australians talked about a time before man where Yowies freely walked the land. Now, it may have literally been a case of before man. We're not entirely sure when the first humans arrived in Australia. It could have been between 50,000 to 100,000 years ago. But that puts them in the same timeline as Neanderthal and other early men. Now, the fossil records don't indicate any large Yowie-like creatures roaming Australia. But the theory is maybe a small amount of these early men got swept across in storms and moved across when the land masses were different and started the idea of the Yowies. I have to point out, I think these theories are very generous with their plausibility. But interestingly, they tie in with other old stories from the indigenous people. Now, when the early men first arrived, they wouldn't have looked so different to the original settlers that they couldn't have coexisted peacefully. But maybe they started competing for resources or maybe land, and we're not sure who struck first, but there are stories of a Yowie war between the humans and the Yowies. Now, if this Neanderthal theory is anything to go by, we know who won. These stories may have been passed down for thousands of years until all that's remembered is this species of hairy, powerful creatures that one day turn their wrath against the humans, and they just live on now in cultural memory, with the occasional hoax and wild man in the woods reigniting people's imaginations. So with all these theories, maybe one is right. If only there was a cryptozoologist out there who could brave the wilderness and track one down. Well, there isn't, because New South Wales is in a strict lockdown, and Wendell Elmwood got arrested last week for setting Yowie traps in national parks. Don't worry, I'm sure he'll get either freed in 1,000 years or when I make one of these videos next. Oh yeah, like, comment, subscribe, that kind of thing. I'll put some links in the description of other places you can find me. Get vaccinated, pat your dog, and stay inside because there might be yowies out there.